The sovereignty of God. For many of us, this phrase might stir up thoughts, concerns, discussions, maybe even arguments about what sorts of control God exerts on creation, and especially upon human wills. In the midst of a pandemic, we may have all kinds of questions for God. Where are you? Why is there? Do you have the power to stop this pandemic? Or do you have the will to stop the pandemic? Honestly, we could get lost in the what's and the whys and the hows of a pandemic as it relates to God. And honestly, I'd actually enjoyed that conversation. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to summarize where a lot of those conversations ultimately lead to this uncomfortable truth. God often doesn't do what we think God should do. A biblical and Christian view of God's sovereignty really entails two primary facets. The first is God is unlimitedly free. The second is God has a providential guidance or care for his creation, especially human beings like you and me. And that proves his trustworthiness. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created time and space, not just the energies and matter that fill time and space. So since nothing inside this universe, multiverse, can affect something beyond the universe or multiverse, nothing in all creation can be a hindrance or a boundary to God's freedom. Looking at the concept of sovereignty, we can speak of sovereign states or nations in our world. And when we do, we're not speaking of the control those states exert upon their citizens. Rather, we're speaking of the liberty those nations have to organize their own affairs, to set their own domestic or foreign policies. So sovereignty equals free choice. God is free. The other side of God's freedom is God's providential care. I exert a similar influence upon my sons by choosing much of what they are or are not exposed to. Ideas, media, opportunities, even people, places, and things. So if you've met my sons, you're in. I work to build guardrails around their lives. Now, I do this, at least I should be doing this, not to limit their freedom in the long term, but to prepare them for greater freedom in the future. The guardrails create a space for them to, mostly in safety, learn to make responsible choices. So all of God's acts are premeditated, and they're predicated upon God's eternal and unchanging character and purposes. God has sovereignly designed and decreed what is good and right for all creation, and his will ultimately cannot be resisted. We talked about this a little bit last week in regards to holiness. God has decreed what is good for humanity to do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God, and that cannot be changed. We have responsibility. God has decreed by his nature that the wages of sin is death, and that cannot be changed. We are all sinners. So death is at work in the world and in our lives. God has also decreed that there's one way to be united with the Father, and that's through his Son, Jesus Christ, who is the one way, truth, and life, and that will not be changed. Life is at work in the world. Now, we can dislike anything or even everything God declares, but we'll never be able to change it. If God is like Jesus, rich in mercy and compassion, overflowing with love, slow to become angry, and wholly committed to making every wrong thing right, why would we want to change what God has decreed? God does what God wills, and the appropriate response is worship. Paul does very, very well at the chapter 11. He says, "Oh, the depth, the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Who was ever given to God, that God should repay them? For from him and to him and through him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen." God is free. But God is also personal, relational, and faithful in love. God makes clear over and over again throughout the scriptures that his word cannot be broken and that his character never changes. God is bound up in his word and eternally bound to upholding the good, the true, and the beautiful, because that's what love does. And God, at the center of his being, is love. God is not free to have a tantrum, corrupt justice, murder, or retaliate evil for evil. God is not free to choose favorites or to recall his love. Romans 11:29 says that his gifts and his calling are irrevocable. The Bible is full of statements, mostly implicit, about what God cannot and will not do. God can and does choose whatever pleases him. And here's where things get really interesting. God created human beings in the image of God. It pleased God, and it continues to please God, to create beings endowed with the capacity and liberty to oppose what pleases him. And God sustains those choices, even when they crush his heart. You could read the prophet Hosea or see Jesus on the cross. Now, this doesn't mean that God has completely let the world go on its own. God is still active in the world to preserve life and goodness, truth and beauty. That's his providential care. But God's activity is curtailed by his commitment to lovingly sustaining the freedom of his creatures. How then does God work for life in a world that is in the grip of sin and death? Romans chapter 8, Apostle Paul deals with this a little bit. He says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us, for the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. So we see death at work. We know that the whole creation has been groaning, is in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. So life is mysteriously at work in the world. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. So life is at work in us. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purposes. Those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Now that's a destiny for you. So that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. We have responsibility and purpose. As we look at God's sovereignty, there are really 3 points I want to close with. The first is, death and life are both at work in our world. Death is the fruit of human rebellion, and life is the grace of God, preserving life and making good out of evil everywhere. Secondly, judgment is part of God's providential care of the world. Now, is this pandemic a judgment from God? Who has known the mind of the Lord? There are things we just don't know, but there are things we do know. We know that God is opposed to everything that hinders and destroys real life, including everything that distracts and pulls people away from loving trust in God, who is the source of real life. So this pandemic has exposed, in my mind, the sick underbelly of our global financial system. 30% of the world's wealth just disappeared in a week or two. How does wealth disappear if it's real? 10 million filings for unemployment in 2 weeks. Our entertainment industries have come to a screeching halt. Sports, travel, bars, restaurants, amusement parks, resorts. The Marvel movies are delayed. We live fragile lives in a fragile world system. So God calls every circumstance his children to come home in him. He has plans for us to share all that he is: goodness, love, truth, and beauty, life, and eternal joy. Third, the greatest mystery of all is human freedom. What do we do with the crazy gift of choice? Too often in suffering or major loss, human beings begin questioning and accusing God rather than owning up to and living into their responsibilities. We have the freedom to choose our path forward. Not absolute freedom like God's, but real freedom nonetheless. We can become victims or victors. Now, I know that's a little bit too black and white, but it points to some truth. Our perspective and our internal orientation to God, life, and ourselves profoundly impacts what we will do in response to suffering and who we will be on the other side of suffering. Will we blame our circumstances, curse God for our pains, or will we accept God's gifts of responsibility and power and the Holy Spirit to overcome. Our choices matter because God has done the unthinkable and decreed that we should be free, a gift beyond value and a responsibility beyond measure. This is the kind of gift that becomes a burden unless you stay close to the giver. That's why Jesus says, abide in me. A pandemic limits some of our freedoms, but it cannot strip us of responsibility. God is not who we want him to be, but wildly himself and beyond our control, though he's never beyond our cry for help. God often doesn't do what we think God should do. We often assume we know what is right for the world based upon what seems right to us or right for us, but God doesn't act that way. God acts or refuses to act based upon who he is and what he desires. God is love, and God desires the maximum joy for all creatures. We have no idea the providential care of God at work at all times to sustain the universe, to sustain our lives, and sustain the tension between human freedom and divine mercy and judgment. How unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. We can trust him when the world doesn't make sense, especially when the world doesn't make sense, because he's bigger, wiser, and loves better than us. He walks with the weak and has modeled in Jesus how to be strong in weakness, how to crush the greatest enemies through love and self-sacrifice. Your questions and your fears matter to God. But the more important question today is, what are you doing with your responsibility to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God in this time?